The sound of tearing fabric cut through the Oyster Bay ballroom like a gunshot, and 300 of New York's most powerful people turned at once. In the middle of that marble floor stood a woman of 27, in a plain button-down shirt and a worn gray skirt, both hands clutching the ruined front of her blouse, her face burning, her eyes wet, and not one sound coming out of her. The woman who'd torn it was still smiling. Vivian Castellano was 29, engaged to the most feared man in the city, and she'd just decided that a servant, who wouldn't beg, deserved to be stripped of whatever dignity she had left. "She's mute," Vivian told the room, and people actually laughed. Nobody stepped forward. The housekeeper tried and was stopped at the shoulder. A capo standing 4 feet away had his hand flat on the table and never lifted it, because an older man watching from the balcony had quietly shaken his head, and the woman on the floor still didn't make a sound. Not one word. Not even when the laughing started. There wasn't a single person in that ballroom who knew her name, and that was exactly the way it had been for 6 years. Vivian was certain she'd just taught a mute little maid her place in front of everyone who mattered. She was half right. Somebody in that room was going to remember this night for the rest of their life. It just wasn't the woman holding her shirt closed. Because 30 seconds later, the front doors opened, and every single person in that ballroom stood up. So if you believe a person's worth has nothing to do with the clothes they wear, hit that like button for us. Share this with someone who's ever been looked straight through, like they weren't even there. And subscribe, because stories like this one deserve to be heard all the way to the end. Now let's go back not to the ballroom, but to 6 o'clock that same morning, in a hospital room in Manhattan, where this whole thing really started. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Clara Bennett sat on the edge of the hospital bed, drawing each lock of her brother's hair through a plastic comb she'd bought at a dollar store. Noah was 17, and his hair had been falling out for 3 months, but he still made his sister comb it every morning because he said that was the only way he could look like the man of the family. He looked up at her through the small mirror mounted on the wall. "Do a good job. I have a date with the nurse from the 4th floor today." Clara tapped the comb lightly against his forehead. "She's 42 years old. I like mature women." He laughed, and the sound made the intravenous line tremble. Clara kept her expression calm because, for the past 6 years, ever since their parents passed away and she became Noah's legal guardian at 21, she'd understood that if she fell apart, there would be no one left to hold them up. Dr. Marsh knocked on the door at 6:15. He didn't sit down, and Clara knew at once that the news was important. "We have the results from the National Registry. There's a bone marrow donor who is a complete match. 10 out of 10. Clara sprang to her feet so quickly that the comb fell to the floor. Noah gave a low whistle. "See? I told you. I have a way with mature women and kind-hearted strangers." But Dr. Marsh didn't laugh. He led Clara into the hallway and closed the door before telling her the rest. The donor was in another state. The coordinating center would hold the donation for only 72 hours. If they hadn't received confirmation of payment and the treatment deposit by then, the donation would be offered to the next patient on the waiting list, and with Noah's tissue type, it could take 2 years to find another match. Noah didn't have 2 years. "His insurance company sent a denial letter yesterday," Dr. Marsh said. "They've classified the procedure as lacking sufficient evidence of medical necessity. You can appeal, but the appeals process takes 90 days. Clara nodded. She didn't ask him to repeat himself. She didn't argue or plead. She asked only one question. "How much is the deposit?" The figure he gave her was more than everything she'd earned over the past 4 years combined, if calculated according to the salary shown on her records. But Clara didn't calculate according to the salary shown on her records. She had a separate fund, opened under a name that wasn't hers and replenished every month for 6 years, and that was the very reason she'd accepted that job in the first place. She told Dr. Marsh she would bring him confirmation of payment before noon. He looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looked after hearing the same promise too many times from families who never came back. Clara went down to the basement, sat in her car, and opened the banking application. A message appeared on the screen, stating that the account had been temporarily frozen at the request of the authorized owner, and that the freeze had been placed at 4:12 that morning. She read it 3 times. She signed out and signed back in. The message remained unchanged. 4:12 in the morning, 2 hours before she'd combed Noah's hair. Clara called the bank's customer service line. The night representative asked for her authorization code. She read it aloud, and after a few seconds of silence, the representative said the code was still valid, but the freeze order had come from an authority above her access level, so the system wouldn't allow it to be removed. Clara asked who had a higher level of authority. The representative said that information wasn't displayed. Clara sat motionless in the car for about a minute. Then she took a yellowed paper card from her wallet. It held nothing but 10 handwritten digits, with no name and no note. In 6 years, she'd used it exactly once. The man who'd given it to her had said the number worked 24 hours a day, even on holidays, even when he was on the other side of the world, and that if anything truly serious ever happened, all she had to do was dial and wait. Clara dialed. The phone didn't ring. Instead, a calm, polite, automated voice informed her that the number she had called was no longer in service, and asked her to check the number and try again. She hung up and dialed again. The same voice answered, the same words. Clara lowered the phone into her lap and stared straight at the concrete wall in front of the car. The account had been frozen at 4:12 in the morning. The emergency number had been disconnected, both in the same night. She left the parking garage at 6:45. At the toll booth, she handed over the last $10 bill in her wallet, then counted the coins the attendant gave back, arranging them in separate stacks by denomination on her lap, because she needed to know exactly how much she had left for the train, $3.75. She slipped the coins into the small compartment on the side of her wallet, where she always kept her train fare, then turned toward central Manhattan. If she couldn't reach him by phone and couldn't unlock the account, there was only one place left she could go. Moretti Tower stood in Midtown, 41 stories of gray glass, and Clara always entered through the side door on 48th Street, the entrance reserved for the technical staff. In 6 years, she hadn't walked through the main lobby even once. She swiped her badge at 7:40. Red light. She swiped it again, more slowly this time, pressing the face of the card flat against the reader. Red light. On the third attempt, the machine gave 2 short beeps, the sound reserved for a badge that had been revoked, not one that was malfunctioning. Clara stood there for several more seconds, the badge still in her hand, then walked around to the front of the building. The main lobby was crowded with people arriving for the morning shift. She took her place behind 3 people in suits, and when her turn came, she set the badge on the counter. The security guard picked it up, scanned it, frowned, then scanned it again. "This badge has been deactivated, ma'am." "Since when?" He turned the monitor slightly so he could see it more clearly. 4:12 this morning. Clara showed no reaction. She had already heard that time once, an hour and a half earlier, while sitting in her car in the hospital basement. "Can you tell me the reason?" "The system only says it was canceled on orders from above. There are no notes." He handed the badge back to her, and as he did, he studied her a little more closely, with the look of someone trying to place a face in the right drawer of his memory. "Which department do you work in?" That was a question Clara wasn't permitted to answer. This guard had been standing behind that desk for at least 4 years. She had passed him hundreds of times, always through the side entrance, always with her head lowered, always keeping the proper distance. He didn't know her name. No one in this building knew her name. That wasn't an accident. It was a condition. "I have an appointment with administration," she said. "What's your name? I need to register you as a visitor." Clara looked at the visitor log lying open on the counter, with its columns for name, company, person being visited, and signature. For 6 years, she had entered and left this building without leaving a single written line in any logbook. She didn't appear on the payroll. There was no photograph of her in the personnel system, and no internal email address bearing her name. The man who'd brought her into the organization had imposed only one condition, and he'd called it the first rule. The shadow had no face, no name, and no voice in front of outsiders. Break that rule once, and she would lose every protection she had been given. She'd signed that rule at 21, in a windowless room, 3 weeks after her father's funeral. "I'll come back later," Clara said. She stepped out of line. The guard had already turned to the next visitor, before she'd taken 3 steps. Outside on the sidewalk, Clara leaned against a lamppost and began to count. Not money, but people. Her badge wasn't part of the standard personnel system. It had been issued separately and encoded separately, and only 3 people in the world possessed the authority to issue it or revoke it. The first was the family's former chief accountant, the woman who had issued Clara's badge 6 years ago, and she died of a stroke the previous spring. Clara still remembered sending flowers without putting her name on the card. The second was Dominic Ferraro, who was currently in Chicago and had been traveling with a business delegation since Monday. Dominic never touched the financial system. He didn't even have an access code for the disbursement fund. The third was Elias Moretti. Clara straightened. She took out her phone and opened the encrypted mailbox she used to send her weekly reports. The last 4 messages she'd sent over the past 3 days were still unread. She opened the internal schedule, the only thing she was still authorized to view, and found an update posted at 5 o'clock that morning, stating that Mr. Moretti's flight from Miami had been postponed until Thursday. That meant he wasn't in the city. It meant he hadn't revoked her badge. But if he hadn't done it, and the chief accountant was dead, and Dominic was in Chicago, then someone had used the authority of one of those 3 people without actually being any of them. Clara looked down at the badge still resting in her hand, a badge with no name, no photograph, and no title, only a string of numbers. For 6 years, she had survived by making herself invisible, and she had always believed that being invisible meant being safe. That morning, she finally understood the opposite. A person whose name didn't exist in any system had no one to file a complaint with. There was no human resources office whose door she could knock on. There was no employment contract she could produce. If someone erased her, she would disappear without leaving behind a single line proving she'd ever existed there at all. Whoever froze her account at 4 a.m. had done it to strip away her options, forcing her to come to Oyster Bay in desperation. And Noah had 68 hours left. Clara opened the banking application one last time. The same message was still there. The same time. 4:12. She turned off the screen and started walking toward Penn Station. In 6 years, she had been to the estate in Oyster Bay only twice. Both visits had been during the day. Both times, she'd entered through the rear door. And both times, she'd been warned never to come on her own unless she was summoned. She knew she was about to break that rule. She also knew she had no other choice. Clara bought a Long Island Railroad ticket, with exactly $3.75 in change she'd counted in the car, along with another $2.50 she'd dug from the bottom of her coat pocket, and the ticket agent had to count it twice before sliding the ticket through the glass. She sat in the last car, in the window seat, with her phone face down on her lap. For the entire hour, she didn't turn it over once, not because she didn't want to look, but because she knew she would look too many times, and that would make time move even more slowly. 67 hours. That was the number she counted silently as the train pulled away from the station, and she decided she wouldn't count it again until she arrived. The train reached Oyster Bay in the late afternoon. It took about 40 minutes to walk from the station to the estate if she followed the main road. But Clara went the long way around, taking the grassy path along the northern fence, the same route she'd used on her 2 previous visits. She didn't take a taxi. A taxi ride would leave a record of the destination, and a record of the destination was something that could be traced. The sky was darkening by the time she reached the final slope, and from that very spot, she knew something was wrong. The main gate was open. It wasn't merely standing ajar long enough for a car to enter before closing again. It was open all the way, both gates drawn back to either side, with guards stationed at each end to direct the arriving vehicles. A line of cars moved slowly through the entrance, one behind another, their red taillights stretching all the way down to the curve in the road. Music drifted out as far as the street, the sound of strings, voices, and glasses touching. Clara stopped in the middle of the grassy path and stood perfectly still. In the 6 years she'd worked for Elias Moretti, she'd read every line of this house's expenses, every roof repair invoice, every maintenance contract, every household employee's wages. She knew exactly how many rooms were in use and how many remained locked throughout the year, and she knew something very few people knew. Elias Moretti had never hosted a party, not once in 6 years. He didn't invite guests into his home, didn't celebrate birthdays, didn't observe holidays, and even on the anniversary of his father's death, only 3 people had sat together in the kitchen. He'd said exactly one thing to her about it, in a text message sent after she suggested reducing the hospitality budget. Home was the only place where he knew for certain who was inside. Yet tonight, at least 100 cars were lined up outside his gate. Clara took one step back. Her first thought wasn't curiosity. It wasn't concern for Elias. It was a reflex that had worked its way into her bones over 6 years. She wasn't allowed to be here, not because of some abstract rule, but because of something painfully specific. If even one guest among that crowd saw her face and remembered it, just one, she would no longer be the shadow. And the moment she ceased to be the shadow, Every layer of protection that name provided for her and for Noah would vanish in a single night. She would become someone who could be found, someone who could be followed, someone who could be used as leverage. She'd signed those rules, and there was only one provision among them that allowed no exceptions. Clara looked down at what she was wearing, a faded buttoned shirt and a frayed gray skirt. The same clothes she wore to work every day because they never made anyone look at her for longer than 3 seconds. Here, it was different. Here, those clothes made her look like a servant. She turned around. She retraced her steps along the grassy path, walking faster than before, her head lowered as she stayed close to the fence to avoid the beams of the headlights. She had gone nearly 40 paces when she heard a door open behind her. The kitchen door in the west wing. Clara faltered for half a beat, then kept walking. Eleanor Pike stood in the doorway, still holding a dish towel, the housekeeper who had watched over this home longer than Elias had owned it. She saw Clara. Clara saw her. During Clara's 2 previous visits, Eleanor had been the only person who'd poured her a glass of water and asked whether she wanted to sit down. She didn't know who Clara was or what her name was. She'd only assumed Clara was some employee who had been summoned to handle paperwork. Eleanor didn't call out. She merely gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, the kind offered by someone who understood that there were certain things one shouldn't ask about, then stepped back inside and closed the door. Clara exhaled and continued walking. She had gone about 20 more paces when she heard tires grinding over gravel to her left. A late-arriving guest's car was backing up to clear the way, and its headlights swept across the grassy path. Clara darted to the right to avoid the beam, but her foot slipped over the edge of a flower bed, and she stumbled forward exactly 3 steps. Those 3 steps carried her out of the darkness, around the corner of the house, and directly onto the stone walkway leading from the porch into the grand hall, where a waiter carrying a tray of wine was coming toward her. The waiter couldn't stop in time. Clara's shoulder struck the edge of the tray tilted, and all 4 glasses of wine slid off the silver surface at once. 2 fell onto the stone floor and shattered. The other 2 spilled over the woman standing on the step just above her. Red wine spread across the white dress in a long stain that ran from her hip to the hem. Someone drew a sharp breath, then the entire porch fell silent. The waiter let go of the tray, bent deeply at the waist, and apologized over and over, taking all the blame upon himself. He said he'd been walking too fast, that he hadn't been watching where he was going, but the woman didn't look at him. She looked at Clara. Vivienne Castellano stood motionless for several seconds, both hands held slightly away from her dress, her gaze traveling from the worn heels of Clara's shoes to her gray skirt, then stopping at her faded blouse. And in that instant, Clara realized that she'd been mistaken for someone she wasn't. That in the past 3 seconds, this woman had already answered the question of who Clara was. People began spilling out of the grand hall and onto the porch. 5 at first, then 10, then more, wine glasses still in their hands as music drifted out behind them. Vivienne turned toward the gathering crowd only once, just once, and very quickly. When she turned back, her voice had changed completely. "How long have you worked here?" Clara lowered her head. She took a handkerchief from her blouse pocket, stepped half a pace closer, and reached out to wipe the wine from the hem of Vivienne's dress. Vivienne snatched the skirt away. "I asked how long you've worked here." Clara stopped. Her head remained lowered, and she still said nothing. Someone in the crowd gave a quiet laugh. "That dress costs more than you earn in an entire year," Vivienne said. "Did you know that?" Clara folded the handkerchief, lowered herself onto one knee on the step, and began gathering the broken glass into the cloth. It was what needed to be done, and she did it neither quickly nor slowly. But Vivienne saw Clara kneeling and understood it as something else entirely. "No," she said. "Stand up." Clara looked up. "Stand up first." Clara rose, still holding the handkerchief filled with broken glass in both hands. Vivienne descended 1 step. By then, more than 30 people had gathered on the porch, and several of them had taken out their phones. They hadn't raised them yet, but the phones were already waiting loosely in their hands. "Apologize to me," Vivienne said, with words. Clara fixed her gaze on the center of Vivienne's chest, neither higher nor lower, then bowed her head deeply. It was the clearest apology she could offer. Someone behind them laughed aloud. Vivienne heard it, and her face hardened. "You think a bow makes this go away?" She descended the 2nd step. "I want to hear you say it. Everyone on this porch wants to hear you say it." Clara remained silent. Can you hear me? Vivian snapped her fingers twice beside Clara's ear. Clara blinked. Vivian saw that blink and knew for certain that Clara could hear her. So you can hear me. She stepped back half a pace, turned toward the crowd, and spread her arms as though inviting them into a game. You see? She hears every word. She simply can't be bothered to answer. The laughter spread. Someone whistled. A man's voice called out that perhaps the girl was so frightened she'd forgotten how to speak English. And the remark made 3 or 4 people laugh even louder. Vivian turned back. Kneel. Clara didn't move. Kneel and apologize. Vivian spoke each word slowly. Then I'll let you go. Clara remained standing. The handkerchief in her hands had become soaked with wine, and at some point a shard of glass had cut her finger, leaving a thin line of blood to seep into the fabric. But she didn't look down. She simply held her position, her head slightly bowed and her eyes lowered, neither defiant nor pleading. To Vivian, that was worse than defiance. She had descended 2 steps in front of 30 people. She had given the order 3 times, and all 3 commands had fallen into silence. Do you know who I am? Vivian asked. Silence. I'm the future wife of the man who pays your wages. Silence. The man everyone in that room has to address as Sir. Silence. Someone in the crowd murmured to the person beside him, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that perhaps there really was something wrong with the girl. Vivian heard him. She straightened, lifted her chin toward Clara, and addressed the entire porch in the voice of someone who had just discovered a clever answer. There's nothing wrong with her. She's mute. This time, the laughter truly erupted, spilling from the porch all the way into the grand hall. Vivian looked around, saw every face turn toward her, and understood that this moment now belonged to her. She seized Clara by the wrist. Inside, she said. It's too dark out here. No one can see clearly. Then she dragged Clara across the threshold and straight into the center of the grand hall, where 300 people stood waiting. The music stopped in the middle of a song when Vivian dragged Clara into the center of the floor. The musician's hands went still when he saw the crowd pouring in from the porch, and in the silence that followed, Vivian's voice rang out with perfect clarity. For anyone who hasn't heard, listen closely. She's mute. 300 people turned at once. On the second floor, at the railing overlooking the grand hall, a man in his 50s stood holding a glass of wine he hadn't taken a single sip from. Gregory Vance had been there since before Vivian dragged the girl inside, and he wasn't surprised. 6 years earlier, in a house in Queens, he had heard a voice coming from behind a bedroom door, the voice of a young woman, and he had never seen the face that belonged to it. He had been searching for that voice for 6 years. Tonight, he had come halfway down the staircase, close enough to hear, and he waited. Vivian was still gripping Clara's wrist. 3 times, she said to the entire room. I told her to apologize 3 times. Someone set a glass down on a table. Someone else stepped back half a pace to get a better view. No one came forward. From the kitchen doorway, Eleanor Pike walked straight into the hall, the dish towel still draped over her hand, moving faster than anyone else in the room. She had taken 7 or 8 steps when a hand settled on her shoulder. It didn't strike or jerk her back. It simply came down and remained there. The man who had done it didn't look at her or say a word. Eleanor tried to take 1 more step, and the hand tightened. She stood still, breathing hard, her eyes fixed on Clara, then turned her head toward the second-floor balcony. Vance looked down at her. He did nothing. In the left corner of the grand hall, beside the long table set against the wall, Dominic Ferraro put down his glass. He had flown back from Chicago that afternoon and had intended to stay out of whatever happened tonight. But he was the only person in the room who had seen this girl before. Once, 4 years earlier, in a basement corridor. She had walked past him carrying a stack of files, and he had only just had time to think that she must belong to the accounting department. He couldn't clearly remember her face, but he remembered that there was some rule concerning people who walked through the basement without ever being introduced. He placed his right hand on the table and began shifting his weight forward to push himself to his feet. Then he looked up. Vance was staring directly at him from the staircase. He shook his head, very slightly, a gesture no one would have noticed unless they happened to be looking at precisely the right moment. Dominic remained seated. His hands stayed on the table and didn't move again. Vivian released Clara's wrist and slowly circled her, like someone walking around an object she was considering buying. 6 years, she said. I've just asked people in this room. No one knows who you are. No one remembers your face. She stopped in front of Clara. What do you do in this house that no one even knows your name? Clara looked down at the floor. Scattered laughter came from a table near the windows. Someone began recording in earnest, no longer merely holding a phone loosely in one hand. Say one word, Vivian said. One word, and I'll let you go home. Silence. One word. Silence. Vivian straightened, and something in her face changed. Until that moment, she had still been performing. She knew she was performing, knew that 300 people were watching, knew she had already won the instant the crowd laughed for the first time. But the woman standing before her refused to play the part she had been given. She didn't cry, argue, kneel, or beg. She merely stood there, her head slightly bowed and her arms hanging at her sides, giving Vivian nothing at all. And that refusal, before 300 people, humiliated Vivian Castellano more deeply than being cursed to her face ever could have. You think you're better than me? Vivian asked, her voice dropping low. You stand there, dressed in that, and you think you're better than me. Someone in the crowd called out for her to let it go, but said it in the voice of a person who was still laughing. Fine, Vivian said. If you don't want to speak, then stand there and keep quiet. She stepped forward. Someone let out a short cry. On the balcony, Vance leaned toward the railing, and for the first time all evening, he stopped breathing so he could hear more clearly. He wasn't looking at Vivian. He was watching the mouth of the girl standing in the middle of the floor, waiting for it to open, waiting for a sound, a cry, anything at all. Eleanor Pike closed her eyes. Dominic turned his face away. And in that moment, in the middle of the Oyster Bay Grand Hall, before 300 people who stood watching, Vivian Castellano reached out and yanked hard. The main doors opened before the laughter had fully died away. No one had announced him. There had been no sound of a car, no one rushing inside to deliver the news. Only the two doors swinging inward and a man stepping across the threshold. The person nearest the entrance saw him first and rose. Then the table beside him rose. Then the entire eastern row of tables. In less than 10 seconds, all 300 people in the Oyster Bay Grand Hall were standing, and no one had told anyone else to do it. Elias Moretti was supposed to remain in Miami until Thursday. He had returned 2 days early without informing anyone, not even his own driver. He stopped 3 paces beyond the threshold and looked toward the center of the hall. A woman stood there with both arms folded tightly across her chest, surrounded by a broken streak of white where the crowd had just drawn away from her. Elias asked no questions. He began walking. People parted automatically before him, not because he signaled them to move, but because they saw the pace at which he was coming. He walked very slowly, slower than a man taking a leisurely stroll, and it was that very slowness that made no one dare breathe too loudly. He passed the table where the people who had laughed the loudest 15 minutes earlier were standing. He passed Eleanor Pike, whose shoulder still bore the imprint of the hand that had just released her. He passed the long table against the wall where Dominic Ferraro stood perfectly straight, and he didn't look at Dominic. He passed the foot of the staircase, where Gregory Vance had retreated 2 steps. He didn't look at Vance. He walked past Vivian Castellano, passing less than a foot from her. He didn't look at her. Not a glance, not a pause, not even 1,000th of a second in which his eyes touched hers. Vivian opened her mouth to say something, but Elias had already passed before she could form the first sound. He stopped in front of Clara. Clara didn't look up. Her arms remained locked across her chest, her fingers white from gripping herself for too long, and tears streamed down both sides of her face. But she made no sound. Not a sob. Not a single broken breath. Elias stood there for about 3 seconds. Then he reached for the collar of his coat and took it off. No one in the grand hall moved. He didn't drape it over her shoulders the way someone might hastily throw a blanket around her. He opened it with both hands, stepped around to her left side, and brought it forward around her from behind so she wouldn't have to turn, so she wouldn't have to lower her arms for even a second. Then he drew the 2 sides together. Then he buttoned it. The bottom button first. He bowed his head, his fingers moving slowly, and throughout the entire hall, the only sound was fabric brushing against fabric. The second button. The third. Somewhere at the far end of the room, someone dropped a fork onto a table, and the sound rang out like something breaking. Elias didn't look up. The 4th button. He pulled the 2 sides straight, smoothed the fabric over her shoulders, then stepped back half a pace. Clara still kept her head bowed. He didn't touch her face, didn't wipe away her tears, didn't offer a single word of comfort. He simply stood in front of her, slightly to one side, positioning his body so it shielded her from the direction where the greatest number of phones were raised. And he remained that way for another 10 seconds. Those 10 seconds lasted longer than everything else that had happened in the grand hall that night. Then he turned around. He looked at the entire room. He said nothing. He only looked. His gaze traveled from left to right, from one table to the next, stopping on each group just long enough for them to understand that he was looking at them, not through them. Someone hurriedly lowered his eyes to his wine glass. Someone else placed a phone face down on the table. 2 or 3 people began to sit by instinct, then immediately straightened again when they realized no one else had moved. No one dared sit down. 300 people remained standing in a room where the music had gone silent, and Elias Moretti still hadn't spoken a single word. After surveying the final row of tables, he lifted his gaze to the second-floor balcony. It was empty now. He lowered his eyes. "Close the doors," he said. His voice was no louder than that of someone ordering a meal. The 2 men at the entrance closed the main doors. The sound of the bolts sliding into place could be heard with perfect clarity. "No one leaves," he continued. "No one makes a call." Then he turned toward the event manager, who stood frozen beside the reception table, still clutching the program folder in one hand, her face drained white. Elias didn't ask who had dragged Clara into the center of the hall. He didn't ask who had laughed. He didn't ask why no one had stepped forward. He asked only one question, and it was the question that no one in the room, not even Vivienne, understood why he would ask. Who authorized payment for tonight's party? The event manager had to ask him to repeat the question. "I'm sorry, sir. What is it you want to know?" "Who authorized the spending?" Elias remained exactly where he was. "You have the records, don't you?" She flipped through the papers in her hands, but her fingers were trembling so badly that she had to set the entire folder on the reception desk before she could turn the pages. "Yes, sir. I have the payment confirmations and the transfer orders." "Read them aloud." No one in the grand hall moved. Vivienne stood about 5 paces away, and for the first time that entire evening, she didn't know where to look. "The event organizers received payment in 3 installments," the manager read, stumbling over the words. "The first covered the venue deposit and staff. The second covered the wine and catering. The third covered the music and flowers." "Who authorized them?" "All of them were approved through the estate's household expense account, sir." "Authorization code." She ran one finger down to the bottom of the page. "The authorization code is 470912. Elias said nothing. The manager looked up, thinking she must have read it incorrectly, then repeated it, more slowly this time. 470912. "The same code appears on all 3 installments, sir." Someone at the eastern table drew a quiet breath, not because they understood, but because they heard Elias release one very long breath. "Do you know whose code that is?" he asked. The manager shook her head. "The records only identify it as level 1 authorization, sir. There's no name." Elias turned around. He looked at Clara, and Clara was still standing there with both arms folded across her chest beneath his coat, her head bowed. He didn't ask her. He didn't need to. 470912. Elias said to the entire room, "Is this house's level 1 authorization code? For the past 6 years, only one person has used it." He paused. "Every expense in this house passes through that code. The roof repairs, the household staff's wages, the flowers on the tables beside you." He gestured toward the long row of tables. "The wine in your glasses, the waiters who poured that wine. Every bit of it was paid for with the signature of the woman standing behind me." A glass was set down on a table. Then another. Elias stepped into the center of the hall. "Mr. Delaney," an older man at the second table startled. 3 years ago, you borrowed $700,000 to save your workshop in Yonkers. Do you remember who approved that loan?" The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. "It wasn't me," Elias said. "I signed the final approval. But the person who examined your books, the person who calculated that you could repay it, the person who rewrote the term from 18 months to 36 so you wouldn't lose your workshop, was code 470912. He turned toward the next table. "There are 3 contractors here tonight. Your contracts were approved with that code, all 3 of them." He pointed toward the far end of the room. "Mrs. Hartley, 2 years ago, your son went to court. His bail money passed through that code. You never knew. You didn't need to know. That was the point. Elias stopped in the middle of the floor. Of the 300 people here tonight, I've counted at least 40 who have received money, received bail, or had a debt extended through that code. 40 people. He looked around the room, and not one of you knew the face of the person behind it. No one spoke. Some began looking toward Clara, then hurriedly turned away. Elias continued, his voice as even as before. As of tonight, you know, the woman you stood and watched for 20 minutes. The woman none of you stepped forward to help. She is the one who signed for you. He returned to Clara and stood slightly in front of her, just as he had before. Then he added one final sentence, no louder than anything else he had said. Tonight's party was paid for with her code. She didn't know there was a party. The first sound in the grand hall after those words was the scrape of a heel slipping across stone. Vivian Castellano staggered back half a step and buckled. She didn't fall completely. One hand caught the edge of the table, but her whole body collapsed lower, and she remained in that position. The person nearest her didn't reach out. No one did. Vivian raised her head and looked toward Elias. She called his name. Not loudly, only a short cry, her voice breaking in the middle. Elias didn't turn around. He hadn't looked at her once since crossing the threshold. And he didn't look at her now. He didn't say a word about their engagement. He didn't announce that it was over. Didn't order her out of the house. Didn't hand her over to anyone. He behaved as though no one named Vivian Castellano existed anywhere in that grand hall. And all 300 people standing there understood that this carried more weight than any declaration ever could. Vivian called his name a second time. Elias reached one hand behind him, touched Clara lightly at the elbow, and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Come with me." Then he led her straight through the center of the grand hall and out the main doors, and not one of those 300 people dared sit down until both doors had closed behind them. Outside in the courtyard, Elias stopped beside the first car in the line, opened the rear door, and told the driver to turn on the headlights. He didn't put Clara inside the car. He knew she wouldn't sit down in front of him. Not now. He took a stack of papers from his briefcase and spread them across the hood. "What did you come here to do tonight?" Clara looked down at the papers. Then she took out her phone, turned on the screen, and held it toward him. The message read, "Account temporarily frozen at the request of the authorized account holder. Time of suspension, 4:12 in the morning." Elias read it. For about 5 seconds, he said nothing. "Anything else?" Clara swiped to the next screen. It showed the insurance company's letter denying coverage, photographed on her phone and dated yesterday. Then came the third screen, a photograph of the paper Dr. Marsh had given her that morning. It named the coordination center, listed the donor slot code, and stated that the slot would be held for 72 hours beginning at 6:15 that morning. Elias studied that number longer than anything else he had just read. "How many hours are left?" Clara raised both hands, opened them, closed them, then opened them again. 64. Elias took out a pen. He didn't ask how much the deposit was, which hospital it was, or why she hadn't told him sooner. Right there on the hood, beneath the headlights, he wrote an immediate disbursement order, crossed out the printed spending limit, replaced it in his own handwriting, and signed his name. He called the driver over, handed him the paper, and said he was to be at the hospital's financial office by 7 the next morning, with no intermediaries and no one else handling the payment. Then he turned back. The blank papers and the pen remained on the hood. Elias stood there with both hands braced against the edge of the car, looking not at Clara but straight ahead at the beam of light stretching across the gravel. "I have one question," he said. Clara waited, in the grand hall. He paused. "How long did you stand there?" Clara raised 2 fingers, folded them down, then spread all 10 fingers. 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Elias said. 300 people. And you didn't say a single word. She didn't react. You knew that all you had to do was tell them who you were, and everything would have stopped in 3 seconds. Clara lowered her head. "Why didn't you speak?" She stood motionless for a while. Then, she slipped one hand into the inside pocket of the coat he had placed around her, and realized it was his coat, not hers. So she had to undo the top button, reach beneath it, and take the wallet from the pocket of her skirt. The corners of the wallet were worn. She opened the innermost compartment, the one where she kept her train fare, and removed a sheet of paper folded into quarters. It had yellowed with age and grown soft along the creases, the particular softness of something that had been unfolded and folded again too many times. She placed it on the hood and pushed it toward him. Elias looked down. He knew what it was before he opened it. Very slowly, one crease at a time, he unfolded the paper. There were only 4 typed lines on it, with no heading and no seal. The shadow has no face. The shadow has no name. The shadow has no voice before outsiders. One violation results in the loss of all protection. Beneath those lines were 2 signatures. One was a woman's signature, small and trembling, written by a 21-year-old girl in a windowless room 3 weeks after her father's funeral. The other was a man's, firm and decisive, cutting across the printed line, dated September 11th, 6 years earlier. His own signature. Elias said nothing. He lifted the paper and read it again from the beginning, taking far longer than 4 lines required. The headlights continued to shine directly across the hood. Behind them, sections of the grand hall began going dark one by one, and engines started as cars pulled away. From the moment Elias had crossed the threshold, he had been searching. He had counted everyone who laughed, everyone who raised a phone, everyone who held Eleanor Pike by the shoulder, and everyone who sat motionless at the table against the wall. He had already made a list in his mind, and he knew what he was going to do with every name on it. But the 3rd line on that paper hadn't been written by anyone on his list. He had written it. He had written it 6 years earlier to keep her safe, and tonight it had stood in the middle of the grand hall, surrounded by 300 people, and kept her silent for 20 minutes. Elias folded the paper along its old creases. He didn't give it back to her. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. "Get in the car," he said. Clara hesitated. "We're not going back to Queens," he said. "We're going to the hospital. You need to be there at 7 in the morning." She got into the car. Elias closed the door for her, walked around to the other side, and before getting in, he looked up at the mansion one last time. The 2nd floor was completely dark. No one remained on the balcony overlooking the grand hall, and he kept his eyes there a little longer than necessary. By 7:10 the next morning, the financial office had received confirmation of payment, and by 8, the coordination center had sent confirmation that the donor slot would be held. Elias didn't go into the hospital room. He stood in the 9th floor corridor, behind the glass partition separating the waiting area from the treatment wing, and looked into room 914. Inside, Clara sat on the edge of the bed with a plastic comb in her hand, brushing her younger brother's hair. She had changed into different clothes. The boy said something, and she shook her head. He said something else, and she lightly tapped the comb against his forehead. He laughed. From where Elias stood, he couldn't hear anything. He could only see them. He remained there for 7 minutes. He didn't open the door, didn't knock, and didn't ask a nurse to tell her he was there. That 17-year-old boy didn't know whom his sister worked for, and Elias understood that if he stepped through that door, the boy would begin to know. He turned away before Clara looked up. Dominic Ferraro was waiting at the far end of the corridor beside the vending machine, and he had been there since 6:30. "I flew back from Chicago the afternoon before last," Dominic said. "I wasn't planning to attend that party. I stopped by because I heard the mansion had been opened." Elias didn't answer. "I was standing at the table against the west wall," Dominic continued, "about 4 paces from where she stood." He paused. "I put my hand on the table. I was going to stand up." Elias looked at him. "I didn't." Elias still said nothing. "Do you want me to tell you why?" Dominic asked. "I don't need a reason," Elias said. "I need to know who shook his head." Dominic's head snapped up. "You knew?" "I know the way you sit," Elias said. "You were sitting like a man who had just been stopped, not like a man who didn't want to stand." Dominic was silent for several seconds. Then he gave him a name. Elias nodded once, very slightly, the kind of nod made by a man who had just received confirmation of what he'd suspected since the previous night. He said nothing more about it. At 9 that morning, in the office on the 41st floor of Moretti Tower, Gregory Vance arrived 15 minutes early for their meeting, and entered with the face of a man who had endured a very bad night. Before he had even cleared the doorway, he began saying that what had happened the night before was unacceptable, that he had ordered a full review of the guest list, that Miss Castellano had clearly gone too far, and that the Castellano family would have to answer for it. He spoke without stopping for nearly 2 minutes. Elias let him finish. Then he pointed to the chair across from his desk. Vance sat down. "I'm not asking you about Miss Castellano," Elias said. Vance stopped. "Then what are you asking?" "At 4:12 yesterday morning, Elias said. Someone froze the disbursement fund linked to this house's Level 1 authorization code. At roughly the same time, the access card belonging to the person who holds that code was revoked, and the emergency contact number tied to the code was disconnected from the network. He placed both hands on the desk. 3 things. One night, I want to know who did them. Vance frowned, and that frown came at precisely the right moment, neither too early nor too late. Are you certain the same person did all 3? I'm certain they happened on the same night. I'll have the system logs reviewed today. You already reviewed them, Elias said. You walked into this office holding the guest records. You investigated something else before I had the chance to ask. Vance set the folder on the desk and pushed it toward him. You're right. I did. He turned to the 3rd page. The order to freeze the fund was executed through an internal administrator account. That account was still active because no one closed it after its owner died. Elias looked down at the page. Who? Margaret Doyle, Vance said. The former chief accountant. She died in April last year. A stroke. Elias didn't take his eyes off the page. You're telling me that a woman who has been dead for 16 months froze the fund at 4 a.m? I'm telling you that someone used her account, Vance said. It was a procedural failure. My failure. I should have ordered all of her accounts closed immediately after the funeral. I'll take responsibility for that. He leaned back in his chair. But I haven't discovered who used it. The login records were overwritten. Elias closed the folder. He didn't mention the procedural failure. He didn't say thank you. He asked only one more question. Where were you last night? Vance answered without hesitation. On the 2nd floor balcony. I went up there to take a call. What did you see? I saw the crowd gathering. I thought someone had fainted. He shook his head. By the time I understood what was happening, it was already too late. Elias rose and walked to the window. He stood with his back to Vance for a long time. Did you know who she was, Gregory? He asked. Behind him, Vance answered with perfect calm. I knew there was someone who held code 470912. For 6 years, I've received reports prepared by that person. He paused, but I had never heard her speak. That afternoon, Vivian Castellano's car remained parked outside a cafe in Great Neck for nearly an hour without her stepping out. She had called Elias 11 times in the past 24 hours, and not one call had rung more than twice before being cut off. She had texted her father, and he hadn't answered. By afternoon, 2 people on the previous night's guest list had personally withdrawn their invitations to the weekend dinner with her family. When Gregory Vance opened the car door and sat down beside her, Vivian was crying, and she cried with fury, not remorse. He walked right past me, she said, less than a foot away. He didn't look at me once. Vance closed the door. I know. I was there. He defended a servant. She isn't a servant, Vivian. I know she isn't a servant. Vivian wiped her face. Now everyone on this whole island knows she isn't a servant. But he hid her for 6 years. Do you understand what that means? People only hide what they're afraid to lose. Vance didn't argue. He handed her a handkerchief and let her cry a little longer. Do you want me to tell you the truth? He asked. Go ahead. You made one mistake, Vance said. Not what you did last night. Your mistake was choosing the wrong place. You did it in front of 300 people, beneath 300 phones, inside his house. He folded the handkerchief. You gave him a stage. All he had to do was step onto it. Vivian fell silent, and that entire room felt sorry for her. Vance continued. You gave her something money can't buy. Vivian looked up. Then what am I supposed to do? Vance didn't answer immediately. He stared through the window for a long while, like a man deciding whether he should speak at all. Nothing, he said. That's my advice. Leave it alone. In a few months, everything will cool down. You know I can't leave it alone. I know, Vance sighed. That's why I'm advising you to. He reached for the folder on the floor, the guest list review he had presented to Elias that morning, and placed it on his lap so he could take the phone from his coat pocket. The folder slipped. Several sheets of paper fell onto the floor of the car. Vance bent to pick them up, but Vivian reached one first. It was an internal personnel review. And the fourth line listed an old contact address, an apartment in Ridgewood, Queens, along with the building number and floor. Vivian read the line for 2 seconds before Vance pulled the paper from her hand. You weren't supposed to see this, he said, his voice hardening for the first time in the entire conversation. I didn't see anything. Vivian. He looked directly at her. I'm serious. Don't do anything else. Do you understand? Vivian nodded. Vance put the folder into his briefcase, said goodbye, and stepped out of the car. He had walked 10 paces when he stopped beside the road, lit a cigarette, and stood there for a long time. That same afternoon, about 25 miles to the east, Clara returned to the Oyster Bay mansion to retrieve the quarterly expense records she had left in her small basement office. She walked up from the station, following the grassy path along the northern fence, just as she had for 6 years. But when she approached the side gate, the gardener who was coiling a hose nearby put it down, walked several steps ahead of her, and opened the main gate. He said nothing. He simply held it open and waited for her to pass through. Clara stopped for half a beat, then entered through the main gate. In the kitchen, the cook had left a plate of food waiting on the table beneath a cloth, and beside it was a note saying that this was her meal, not leftovers. Clara looked at the note longer than she looked at the food. Eleanor Pike entered through the back door, still holding a dish towel as she always did, and stopped in the middle of the kitchen. I need to tell you something, she said. Clara turned around. For 6 years, you've come into this house through the back door, Eleanor said. I can count at least 40 times. I poured you water twice. I asked whether you wanted to sit down twice. She tightened her grip on the towel. But I never once asked your name. Clara opened her mouth, then closed it. I kept thinking I shouldn't ask, Eleanor said. I thought that was a way of showing respect. But the night before last, I stood 7 paces away from you, and I couldn't call out to you, because I didn't know what to call you. She looked down at the floor. I'm sorry. Clara stood still for a moment. Then she walked to the kitchen table, pulled the note beside the plate toward her, turned it over, and wrote on the back with the pen tucked inside the utensil holder. She pushed the paper toward Eleanor. There were 2 lines on it. The first was her name. The second said that in the 6 years she had spent in that house, Eleanor was the only person who had ever poured her a glass of water. Eleanor read it, and she had to sit down in the nearest chair. Elias went down to the basement at 7 o'clock that evening and found Clara in the small office at the end of the corridor, the windowless room where she had sat for 6 years. She was placing the quarterly expense files into her briefcase. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. From the inner pocket of his coat, he took the sheet of paper folded into quarters, the paper he had kept since that night beside the hood of the car, and laid it on the desk between them. Clara looked at the paper, then at him. Read it again, Elias said. She didn't touch it. Then I'll read it. He unfolded the paper, turned it so it was straight, and read each line slowly, placing no emphasis on any of them. The shadow has no face. The shadow has no name. The shadow has no voice before outsiders. One violation results in the loss of all protection. When he finished, he remained silent for a long time. I wrote this when I was 31, he said. I had just taken control. I thought I was doing something intelligent. He placed one finger on the third line. I thought that if no one ever heard your voice, no one would ever find you. Clara lowered her eyes. 20 minutes, Elias said. 300 people. And the thing that kept you standing still, in the middle of that grand hall, wasn't Miss Castellano. He lifted the paper with both hands. It was this line. Then he tore it. He tore it in half lengthwise, then tore it in half again, and then again, doing it slowly, without anger, like a man dismantling something he had once built with his own hands. He let the scraps fall onto the desk. It's over, he said. There are no more rules. Clara looked at the torn pieces scattered across the desk. Speak. She raised her head. Anything, Elias said. It doesn't have to be long. Clara opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She closed it, swallowed, then tried again. This time her lips parted, and a breath slipped through her teeth, but it didn't become a sound. She lifted a hand to her throat and touched it very lightly, like someone feeling for something to see whether it was still there. Elias said nothing. He didn't step toward her. Clara tried a second time. She drew a deeper breath, forced it upward, and this time a real sound emerged. But it wasn't a word. It was a low, hoarse sound that broke apart halfway through, like an old door being pushed open after years of standing shut. She stopped at once. Her face flushed deep red, and she turned away, covering her mouth with her entire hand. Her shoulders began to tremble. Elias remained exactly where he was. He didn't tell her it was all right. He didn't tell her to take her time. He didn't say any of the things people usually said in moments like that. He simply pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, bringing his eyes level with hers, and waited. In that windowless room, the only sound was the ventilation system humming overhead. Clara stood with her back to him for nearly a minute. She thought about how many evenings she had spent in this room, how many reports she had sent, how many signatures she had written, and how many sentences she had spoken to other people over those 6 years. To doctors, to ticket clerks, to Noah. And she realized that with everyone else in the world, she had never once opened her mouth. 6 years was long enough for the body to learn that there were certain things it no longer needed to do. She turned around. Elias was still sitting there. "One more time," he said. "Then we stop. I'm not forcing you to do anything." Clara placed both hands on the edge of the desk. She lowered her head, drew in a slow breath, and didn't try to force it upward as she had the other 2 times. This time, she let it find its own way out. Her lips moved first, shaping a word, and only then did the sound follow. Elias. Just one word. Hoarse. Low. Breaking at the end. Almost impossible to hear unless someone was sitting close. But it was a complete word. Clara heard her own voice, and she began to cry at once. Not the way she had cried in the grand hall, without sound, without trembling. This time she truly cried. She sobbed aloud, both hands gripping the edge of the desk as her whole body folded forward, and she wept like someone who had just found something she hadn't even known she had lost. Elias didn't stand. He didn't reach for her. He remained seated with both hands resting on his thighs and let her cry until there was nothing left. It took a long time. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were swollen and her face was wet, and she looked at him as though she were waiting for him to say something. He did. "Say it again." She froze. "My name," he said. "Say it one more time." Clara swallowed. "Elias." This time it was a little clearer. Again. "Elias." He nodded. Then he stood, gathered every scrap of torn paper from the desk into his palm, and didn't throw them into the wastebasket. He put them in his coat pocket. "Starting tomorrow, you won't work in the basement anymore," he said. "Your office is moving to the 41st floor, next to mine." Clara opened her mouth to object. "Now that you can speak, you can object," Elias said, "but not tonight." He reached the doorway, then stopped with one hand resting against the frame, without turning around. 6 years, he said. "I never heard your voice once, and I thought that was because I was keeping you safe." He stepped out into the corridor. "It turns out I was only protecting myself from having to listen." 3 days later, in his office on the 41st floor, Elias summoned Clara and turned the monitor toward her. "I had every piece of camera footage from the mansion that night retrieved," he said. "I didn't go through the security team. I brought in outsiders to do it." Clara sat down. On the screen was a list of video feeds, 14 rows in all, each one corresponding to a different area. "The Grand Hall," Elias said, opening the first row. "Complete. From 7 o'clock in the evening until 2 o'clock in the morning. Not a single second missing." He moved through the recording. The image was clear, and the angle wide, showing the entire floor and even the foot of the staircase. The west corridor, complete. The kitchen, complete. The front courtyard, the gate, the parking area, all complete. He opened another feed. The east wing. An empty corridor appeared on the screen, dimly lit, with the closed door of the study at the far end. Elias slowed the footage. "Look at the lower right corner." A small table stood against the wall, with a vase of flowers resting on it. Elias let the recording play. The vase remained still. The corridor was empty. Nothing happened. "Now watch the third petal from the left," he said. That petal drooped slightly, then lifted again, then drooped, then lifted, over and over. "The same segment," Elias said, repeating from the beginning. He stopped the recording. "It begins at 9:37. It ends at 9:48. Clara stared at the 2 times. 11 minutes, Elias said. He opened the Grand Hall feed again, pulled the timeline back to exactly 9:37, and let the 2 recordings play side by side. On the right was the East Wing corridor, where the petal kept drooping and rising. On the left was the Grand Hall, and in the middle of the marble floor stood a woman as the crowd closed in around her. Clara placed both hands on her lap. 9:37, Elias said. You were dragged into the middle of the hall. He moved the footage forward. 9:40. The music stopped. He moved it again. 9:44. Mrs. Pike was held by the shoulders. He moved it again. 9:47. He didn't describe what happened at 9:47. He simply stopped the recording. 9:48, he said. I walked through the door, and at that exact second, the East Wing corridor returned to normal. Clara sat motionless. Her right hand began tightening around a fold of her skirt, and she didn't realize she was doing it. All 13 of the other feeds are intact, Elias said. Only one was tampered with. The one pointed directly at the study door. He tapped one finger against the desk. The East Wing study has a safe built into the wall. It holds the hard copies of the ledgers from the past 3 years. Clara looked up. I checked, he said. Nothing is missing. Not a single page. He paused. But the handheld scanner kept in the desk drawer shows signs of having just been charged. Clara gripped the fold of her skirt more tightly. So what happened in the Grand Hall, Elias said, wasn't the main event. He turned his chair until he was facing her. It was noise. Clara said nothing. She was staring at the screen on the left, watching the crowd close around her, and now she saw it in an entirely different way. All 300 people in that Grand Hall had been looking in the same direction that night. Every one of them, in the same direction, for 11 minutes. Someone knew exactly how much time was needed, Elias said. And someone knew precisely what would make that entire room turn its head. He opened another window on the monitor. I had the guest list checked again. Not the version I was given. The original kept by the event organizers. He turned the screen toward her. 297 people were on the official list, but the original had 302. He pointed to 5 highlighted rows at the bottom. These 5 people were added at 4 o'clock that afternoon. No invitations. The note says they were guests of the event organizers. Clara read from top to bottom. The first was a name she didn't recognize. The second was unfamiliar too. So were the third and fourth. The fifth was Peter Lang. The hand gripping her skirt released the fabric. Then she placed both hands on the edge of the desk, and Elias saw them trembling. You know that name, he said. Clara didn't answer. She read the row once more slowly this time, as though waiting for it to change into another name. Beside it was his occupation, listed as independent auditor. Peter Lang, Elias said. I had him investigated. 6 years ago, he audited a transportation company in Long Island City. That company dissolved the same year. Clara continued staring at the screen. Do you know that company? She gave the smallest nod. Do you want to tell me about it now? Clara opened her mouth. She had been speaking for 3 days now. She had spoken to him, spoken to Dr. Marsh, and said Noah's name for the first time in 6 years, only to hear it break into tears in the middle of the hospital room. But the name on this screen wasn't something she could release merely by opening her mouth. She closed it again and shook her head. Elias studied her for a long time. He didn't press her. All right, he said. Then I'll ask you something else. He pointed to the 4 names above Peter Lang's. Do you recognize any of these 4? Clara shook her head. Then it was only one man, Elias said, circling the 5th row. Someone brought an entire party of 300 people into my house just to slip one man through the door. Throughout the following week, they worked in the East Wing study, comparing every line in 3 years of ledgers against the transfer records, trying to determine what was hidden there that was worth the trouble of staging an entire party for 300 guests. They worked late into the night. On the 4th night, Elias set a cup of tea beside her elbow, and when Clara picked it up, she realized there was no sugar in it. She couldn't remember ever telling anyone that. She looked at him. He didn't raise his head. You've been leaving tea bags in the basement wastebasket for 6 years, he said. There's never a sugar packet with them. On the 6th night, Clara remained seated after he had stopped speaking for quite some time, and she noticed that he was still sitting upright, but his eyes were closed. She started to rise and leave. The scrape of her chair made his eyes open instantly. On the 7th night, she tried something. When he closed his eyes, she didn't leave. She pulled the keyboard toward herself and began to type, steadily tapping out meaningless things, the names of columns in the table, the strings of numbers she was cross-checking. He didn't open his eyes. He slept for almost 40 minutes, longer than she had ever seen him sleep before. When he woke, he looked at the keyboard, then at her. "How long have you been doing that?" 40 minutes. Her voice was still hoarse, and she still wasn't accustomed to hearing it herself. 6 years ago, someone typed in the hallway outside every night, he said. Mrs. Doyle. She worked on the books until 2 in the morning. He said nothing more. Clara didn't ask. On the 9th night, they found a recurring payment in the 3rd quarter of each of the 3 years. The same amount each time, under the same partner code, and Clara leaned across the desk to point at the screen at the exact moment Elias reached for it too. Their hands stopped barely a finger joint apart. Neither of them pulled away. Clara looked up, and he was watching her, and the only sound in the study was the hum of the computer fan. The phone on the desk vibrated. Elias picked it up, listened for 3 seconds, then rose and stepped into the hallway. By the time he returned, it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and neither of them mentioned the moment again. On Thursday evening of the following week, Clara stayed at the hospital until 11 o'clock. Noah had been on his preparation regimen for 5 days, and all his hair had fallen out. He made his sister put the plastic comb away in the drawer, saying that now all she would be combing was air. Clara reached the parking lot at 11:10. She had driven 3 blocks when she realized the dark sedan behind her had made the same 3 turns she had. She turned a 4th time onto a narrow street, and it followed. She dialed Dominic's number once, and didn't have time to say anything before she saw 2 other cars rolling in from ahead, pulling sideways to block the street. The sedan slammed on its brakes. Dominic Ferraro stepped out, walked to the driver's door, and tapped on the window. When the glass lowered, he reached inside and took the gun lying across the lap of the man behind the wheel before the man could react. No one was struck. No shots were fired. Dominic opened the door, pulled the man out, handed him over to 2 of his people, and the whole thing was finished in less than a minute. Clara remained seated in her own car, both hands still resting on the steering wheel. Dominic searched the passenger seat of the sedan. There was a notebook, a cheap phone, and a sheet of paper bearing Clara's license plate number and the address of her old apartment in Ridgewood. He folded the paper, then opened the notebook, and tucked between the final pages was a photograph. It had been printed on paper, and it was old, its edges curled. The photograph showed a middle-aged man wearing glasses, standing in front of a company sign with a folder in his hands. Dominic didn't know who he was. He carried the entire notebook to Clara's car door and held up the photograph. Clara looked at it, then she opened the door and stepped out, and she had to steady herself against it. "You know this man?" Dominic asked. Clara nodded. "Who is he?" "My father." Dominic looked at the photograph, then at her, then back at the photograph. "When was this taken?" 4 months before he died." She reached out and touched the edge of the picture, but she didn't take it. "The original is in a box with my belongings, in the closet in Ridgewood." Dominic called Elias right there. He spoke briefly, and the final thing he said left the other end of the line silent for quite some time. He said that Miss Castellano might have Clara's address, and she might have her license plate number, but there was no way she could possess a photograph of a man who had died 6 years earlier, when she herself didn't even know who he was. 40 minutes later, Clara was sitting in the back seat of Elias's car, traveling east on Route 25. She didn't ask where they were going. When the car turned onto the grassy lane along the northern fence, she realized they were returning to Oyster Bay. Elias opened the door for her at the main entrance. "West wing, 2nd floor," he said. "The first room." Clara stopped at the foot of the staircase. In 6 years, she had never once gone up to the 2nd floor of this house. She had only ever been permitted to pass the foot of that staircase, and she had always kept walking, never stopping. The following morning, Dominic sent men to the apartment in Ridgewood to collect Clara's belongings. Among the things they brought back was a flat tin cookie box, sealed with tape along all 4 edges. The tape yellowed with age. Clara carried it down to the East Wing study at 9 o'clock that night. Elias was sitting at his desk. She placed the box in front of him and remained standing. "I have a question," she said. Her voice was still hoarse, and she still had to pause midway through a sentence to catch her breath, but she no longer looked away. "I've kept this for 6 years." Elias looked at the box. "The night of March 14th, Clara said. "You owe me an answer." She peeled away the tape. She had to use both hands, and it took quite some time because the adhesive had hardened. Inside was a stack of documents, a family photograph, and, resting on top, a sheet of paper enclosed in a clear plastic sleeve. She removed the paper and placed it on the desk, turning it so he could read it. It was a photocopy. There were only 7 typewritten lines, with no heading, no address, and no recipient's name. It contained an order to deal with Thomas Bennett, clearly stating his name, his place of employment, and the date. The date printed on it was March 11th, 6 years earlier. In the lower right corner was a seal. Elias didn't touch the paper. He stared at it for a very long time. My father was an accountant for a transportation company in Long Island City, Clara said. He worked there for 19 years. That February, he found a discrepancy in the books. He reported it. They told him to leave it alone. She paused to catch her breath. He didn't. He redid the entire reconciliation for the previous 3 years, and he paid an outsider with his own money to examine it. Elias looked up. On the night of March 14th, someone came to my house close to midnight, Clara said. I was 21. Noah was 11. He was asleep in the back room, and he didn't hear anything. He slept straight through until morning. She spoke that sentence very slowly, shaping each word with care, as though it were the most important thing in the entire story. But I heard. Elias didn't ask what she had heard. 3 weeks after the funeral, Clara said, someone found me and offered me a job. That person told me that if I signed those 4 lines, my brother and I would be protected. She placed one finger on the paper lying on the desk. I obtained this 5 months later, from a filing cabinet I was never supposed to open. She looked directly at him. The seal in the corner belongs to your family. The only sound in the study was the hum of the computer fan. Elias remained seated, both hands resting on the desk, and he didn't say any of the things an accused man usually said. He didn't say it wasn't me. He didn't ask who told you that. He didn't ask why she had waited until now to reveal it. He reached over and switched on the desk lamp, drew the paper closer, and bent down to examine the seal. He studied it for nearly half a minute. Then he rose, walked to the safe built into the wall behind him, opened it, and removed a small wooden box. Inside was a bronze seal. He carried it back to the desk, took a blank sheet of paper, stamped it, and placed the 2 sheets side by side beneath the lamp. Then he turned them both toward Clara. Look at the lower edge, he said. Clara bent closer. On the freshly stamped sheet, the lower border of the seal was unbroken. On the photocopy she had brought, there was a tiny gap along the lower edge, an indentation no larger than the tip of a needle, breaking the border at a single point. This seal has never had that mark, Elias said. It was cast in 1974. It has remained inside this safe since the day my father died. He placed one finger on the tiny indentation. Whatever stamped your paper wasn't this. Clara didn't take her eyes from the 2 sheets. How many seals are there? She asked. 1, Elias said. Officially, there is 1. He sat down. But in 1996, my father had a backup die made in case this one was ever lost. He never used it. Where is it? Elias didn't answer immediately. I don't know, he said. I've never seen it. I only know it exists. Clara lowered herself into the chair across from him. She moved very slowly, like someone who had been standing for too long. For 6 years, she had carried that sheet of paper inside a tin box, and every time she opened it, she had looked at that seal. Yet in all those years, she had never once thought to compare it with the real one, because she had never been given the chance to see the real one. There's one more thing, she said. Elias waited. The outsider my father paid with his own money to examine the books, Clara said. He worked on them for 2 weeks. Then he changed his mind. She drew a breath. He signed a different audit. The one with the numbers altered to make everything balance. The one my father refused to sign. Elias placed both hands on the desk. Name. Peter Lang, Clara said. She spoke the name clearly, without stumbling, though her voice broke on the final word. I haven't been able to find him for 6 years. She raised her eyes. Last week, he was standing in the grand hall of your house. Elias asked nothing more about Peter Lang. He sat in silence for a very long time, and Clara realized he was working through something else. 3 weeks after the funeral, he said, you told me someone found you and offered you a job. Yes. Who found whom first? Clara didn't answer at once. I'll ask again, Elias said, his voice still even. 6 years ago, did someone come looking for you and bring you into my service? Or did you put yourself somewhere you knew my people would find you? She could lie. She knew exactly what to say to make the story end here. and she'd had 6 years to practice the sentence. "I chose it," she said. Elias didn't move. "I knew which company my father worked for," Clara said. "I knew whose trucks that company hired and whose goods it carried. I knew the name Moretti before I knew your face." She placed both hands on her lap. "3 weeks after the funeral, I found a way to be somewhere your people would pass through. I let them see that I knew how to keep books. Then I waited." She raised her eyes. "By the time someone asked whether I wanted a job, I'd already been waiting for 11 days. What did you enter my house to find?" "What I just placed on the desk." Elias looked at the paper with the broken seal along its lower edge. He stared at it for a very long time, and this time he didn't bend down to examine it again. 6 years, he said. "For 6 years you sat inside my house believing I was the man who ordered your father's death." "Yes." "You approved every expense for me. You kept my books. You saved Delaney's workshop. You sat in that basement until 2 o'clock in the morning." He spoke each sentence separately, without emphasis. "And you still believed it." "Until 10 minutes ago." Elias stood. He walked to the window and remained there with his back to her, both hands in his pockets. Clara waited. She waited for him to become angry, waited for him to say something cruel, waited for anything she could push back against. He did none of those things. "You've been able to speak for 3 weeks, he said. "I tore up that rule 3 weeks ago." "Yes. You had 3 weeks to tell me this." Clara didn't answer. Elias turned around. His expression hadn't changed, but something around his eyes had collapsed. "I thought you were silent because I had commanded you to be silent," he said. "I carried that with me for 3 weeks." He walked to the desk, picked up the phone, and dialed a number. He spoke briefly, only a few sentences, telling them to prepare a car, to move her out of the mansion tonight, and to take her to the apartment on 42nd Street instead of returning her to Ridgewood. Then he set the phone down. "You're throwing me out," Clara said. "I'm taking you out of this house," Elias said. "That isn't the same thing." He picked up the tin box and handed it back to her. "Every expense for Noah remains covered. No change of hospital, no change of doctors, no change in treatment. The 2 guards on the 9th floor stay where they are. If anyone pulls them away, call Dominic directly." Clara took the box. "Elias." He stopped at the door. "I didn't lie to you," she said. "When you asked, I told you the truth." "I know," he said. "The problem is that I had to ask." He left the study. The car departed Oyster Bay at 11:40 that night. At that very hour, nearly an hour's drive away, Gregory Vance sat in a private back room of a restaurant that had already closed in Bayside and made 3 phone calls. The first was to the heads of the 2 northern factions. The second was to a man in New Jersey. The third was to Rocco Castellano. He told Rocco that it was time for them to sit down, that certain matters couldn't be allowed to drift any further, and that he would bring the records with him. Rocco asked what records he meant. Vance said 3 years of Moretti ledgers had been copied and taken out of the mansion, that it had happened inside the house itself, during the party, and that everyone on Long Island knew who had organized that party. At the other end of the line, Rocco remained silent for a long time before saying he would come. Vivian Castellano stood in the corridor outside the private room. She had gone there to find Vance because he was the only person who had still answered her calls during the past 2 weeks. The door hadn't closed completely. She heard the third conversation from beginning to end. When Vance stepped out to get water, she pushed open the door and opened the briefcase resting on the chair. Inside was a thick dossier that had already been bound, and her name was printed on the cover. She began turning the pages. There was a copy of the guest list showing 5 names added at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and every one of those 5 entries carried a note stating that the event organizers had added them at Miss Castellano's request. There was a copy of the contract with the event planning company bearing her signature. There was a floor plan of the mansion, and the East Wing corridor had been circled in red. Vivienne stood staring at the dossier for a long time. She had come there that night to ask a man to help her reclaim what she had lost. That man, however, had spent 2 weeks binding together a stack of papers that turned her into something he could place on the table. She heard footsteps in the corridor. She closed the briefcase, slipped out through the rear door, and stood in the parking lot for a very long time before getting into her car. The bone marrow transplant took place on Tuesday morning, and it was far shorter than Clara had imagined, lasting just over 2 hours, with nothing dramatic about it, only a bag of fluid and an intravenous line. Noah slept through the entire procedure. 9 days later, The tests showed that the new cells had begun to grow, and that night Clara slept for 4 straight hours, the first time she had done so in weeks. By the 13th day, Noah had developed a rash on his neck and palms, along with a mild fever, and Dr. Marsh called her into the hallway. He told her it was a reaction in which the graft attacked the recipient's body, that most cases could be controlled when they appeared this early, and that they would increase his medication and monitor him day by day. He spoke in the calm voice of a man who had delivered those words many times before. Clara nodded, thanked him, and returned to the room, where she sat beside Noah until he fell asleep. He didn't ask any questions. He only complained that the rash itched and made her promise that when he left the hospital, she would take him to the old place for a sandwich. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Clara went out into the 9th floor hallway and sat on the row of plastic chairs across from the elevator. She didn't return to the apartment on 42nd Street because that apartment wasn't hers. She didn't go back to the Moretti Tower because she no longer had a pass. She didn't call Elias because she had counted the days, and it had been 11 since the night she left Oyster Bay, and in all those 11 days, he hadn't called her once. She had $38 left in her wallet. She sat there with both hands resting on her lap, staring at the closed elevator doors. At that exact moment, the doors opened. Vivian Castellano stepped out. She wore no makeup. Her hair was tied at the nape of her neck, and the only thing she carried was a phone. Clara rose instinctively. "Sit down," Vivian said. "I didn't come here to hurt you." Clara remained standing. Vivian stopped 3 paces away. She looked at the row of chairs, then at the door to room 914 at the far end of the hallway, and finally down at the floor. "I practiced this the entire way here," she said. "Now I've forgotten all of it." She took a ragged breath. "Vance set me up. He used my signature on those event contracts so I'd take the fall for everything that happened that night. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I refuse to be his scapegoat." Clara waited. "I have this." Vivian raised the phone. 2 weeks ago, I was sitting in a car with Mr. Vance. I started recording because I was afraid he would say one thing and do another. I recorded him to protect myself." She bent down and placed the phone on one of the plastic chairs instead of handing it directly to Clara. "There's a part where he tells me that the maid must be made to talk, no matter what it takes." Those were his exact words. He said it before the night at the mansion. Clara looked at the phone. "There's another part," Vivian said. "He mentions a name. Peter Lang. He told me that if anyone asked, I should say the man was my guest." She stepped back half a pace. "I swear to you, I didn't know who that name belonged to then. I still don't." Clara still didn't touch the phone. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse, and Vivian faltered at the sound of it, because it was the first time she had ever heard this woman speak. "Nothing," Vivian said. She stood motionless for a moment. "Do you know what I thought that night? I thought I was showing 300 people who I was." She gave a short laugh with no trace of amusement in it. "It turns out I was only finishing the dirty work for a man of 60. He stood on the balcony. He didn't have to lay a hand on anything." Clara said nothing. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Vivian said. "I know there's no chance of that. I only want to say that I know what I did." She paused. "And I'm sorry." The words left her mouth awkwardly, breaking in the middle, sounding nothing like anything she had ever said before 300 people. She didn't wait for Clara to answer. She turned away and pressed the elevator button, and as she waited, she added one last sentence with her back still turned. "He's arranging a meeting this weekend. He has a dossier that puts all of it on me." The elevator doors opened. "I don't care about that anymore." She stepped inside. The doors closed. Clara sat down on the row of plastic chairs. She picked up the phone, opened the recording, listened to it once from beginning to end, then listened a second time. After that, she sat perfectly still. She remained there for about 10 minutes, and during those 10 minutes, she thought with perfect clarity about what she was holding in her hands. She had the recording. She had the paper bearing the counterfeit seal. She had 3 years of ledgers she had prepared with her own hands. Every line, every payment, every partner code. With those 3 things, she could walk into a federal building on any morning and bring down the entire house that had stood in Oyster Bay for 60 years, along with everyone inside it, including the man who had signed the disbursement order on the hood of a car beneath the headlights, including the man who had torn up those 4 lines and stayed behind, waiting for her to force out a single sound. Her father had died because he believed that the right set of papers would settle everything. Clara opened her contacts. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't call anyone in Manhattan. She dialed Dominic Ferraro, and when he answered at 3:20 in the morning, she said only one sentence. "Where is this weekend's meeting?" The warehouse in Red Hook had one rolling door and one smaller door along the side, and on that Saturday night, only 11 cars were parked against the wall. Elias Moretti arrived last. He got out alone, told the driver to wait outside, and walked through the side door carrying nothing but an envelope. The man guarding the entrance looked at him, then stepped aside. Inside, 11 men sat around a long wooden table. Rocco Castellano occupied the seat at the northern end. Gregory Vance stood instead of sitting, and before him lay a bound dossier. "You're late," Vance said. "I'm on time," Elias said. "You simply arrived 2 hours early." Vance didn't answer. He opened the dossier and began his presentation. He said that 3 years of the Moretti family's ledgers had been copied and taken outside. He said it had happened inside the mansion itself, during a party held without the master of the house knowing what was taking place, arranged by an outsider. He produced the contract hiring the event company, bearing Vivian Castellano's signature. He produced the list of 5 names added at 4 o'clock that afternoon. He produced the floor plan with the east wing corridor circled in red. Then he rested one hand on the papers and delivered his final line, saying that a man who allowed such a thing to happen inside his own home was no longer capable of holding that home together. Rocco Castellano didn't look at his daughter's name in the dossier. He looked at Elias. "Do you have anything to say?" Elias placed the envelope on the table but didn't open it. "I'm waiting." Vance frowned. "For what?" The small side door opened. Clara Bennett walked in. She was wearing the same faded buttoned shirt and frayed gray skirt she had worn in the Oyster Bay Grand Hall that night. She walked to the southern end of the table, stood straight, and spoke. "My name is Clara Bennett." At the opposite end of the table, the glass in Gregory Vance's hand fell to the concrete floor and shattered. He spun around. It wasn't the reaction of a man surprised to see a stranger enter a private meeting. His head turned before his eyes could even find the direction, his entire body following the sound instead of the sight, and his face went white for 1 second before he managed to compose it again. All 11 men in the warehouse saw it. "My father was Thomas Bennett," Clara continued. "He worked as an accountant for a transportation company in Long Island City for 19 years. He died on the night of March 14th, 6 years ago." She looked directly at Vance. "That night, I was standing behind the bedroom door. I was 21. You didn't see my face." She paused. "But you heard my voice." Vance said nothing. "You've spent 6 years searching for this voice," Clara said. "You searched for it in the grand hall of the Moretti mansion. You had a woman of 29 do that work for you, while you stood on the balcony and watched." She placed the phone on the table and pressed play. Gregory Vance's voice rang clearly through the warehouse, telling someone that the maid had to be made to speak at any cost, then mentioning the name Peter Lang, and instructing that if anyone asked, they should simply say he was a guest. The recording lasted less than a minute. No one moved until it ended. Then Clara placed the sheet of paper sealed inside a plastic sleeve on the table, and beside it, she laid the blank sheet bearing the genuine seal that Elias had brought inside the envelope. She pushed both toward Rocco Castellano. "Look at the lower edge of the seal," she said. Rocco bent over them. He studied them for quite some time. Then he raised his head and looked at Vance, and with the back of his hand, he pushed the bound dossier into the middle of the table. "I withdraw," Rocco said. "I won't sit in this chair anymore." 2 men from the northern branches rose with him. Vance remained standing in the same place, and for the first time that entire evening, he had nothing left to present. A long silence settled over the warehouse, and everyone knew what the old rules said should follow a silence like that. Elias stood. Clara spoke before he could. "My father died because he believed that a set of accurate papers would settle everything," she said. "He was wrong. But don't turn him into the reason another body falls tonight." She looked around the table. "I have 3 years of ledgers. I entered every line myself. I didn't bring them here to trade them for a man's life." Elias looked at her. Then he nodded. On Monday morning, Elias Moretti went personally to the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York with his lawyer, bringing Gregory Vance, every recording, the counterfeit seal, and 3 years of ledgers. The price was that a part of the empire his father had left him would have to step into the light and could never return to the shadows again. He knew that price before he crossed the threshold. He crossed it anyway. Peter Lang was summoned 3 weeks later. Noah Bennett survived the complications at the end of the month, left the hospital after 7 weeks, and the first thing he did was make his sister take him to the old place for a sandwich, exactly as she had promised. The engagement between the two families ended in a brief meeting between Rocco Castellano and Elias, with neither side losing face. Vivian left New York in the fall, enrolled again at a school out of state, and contacted no one. Dominic Ferraro was placed in charge of the entire effort to bring the organization's operations into the legal world, and the first thing he did was abolish the rule forbidding workers' names from being entered into the records. 3 months later, Clara returned to Oyster Bay. She wore her old shirt and gray skirt because that was what she wanted. Out of habit, she followed the grassy path along the northern fence, and when the gardener saw her from a distance, he set down the hose, opened the main gate, and called her by name. In the kitchen, Eleanor Pike poured Clara a cup of tea without sugar and set it before her, then sat in the chair across from her instead of remaining on her feet. Elias was waiting in the grand hall. He didn't kneel. He carried no ring. He handed her an access card, and on that card was her photograph, her full name, her job title, and an employee number recorded in a system that anyone in the building could search. "For 6 years," he said, "I protected you by erasing you. From now on, I'll protect you by letting the whole world know your name." Only then did he ask her that other question. This story leaves us with a few very simple truths. A person's dignity doesn't reside in the clothes they wear or the work they do, but in the way they hold on to themselves when they're treated at their very worst. A society that forces people to remain silent in order to stay safe is broken at its foundation, no matter how good the intentions of the person who created that rule may have been. In the grand hall that night, the guilty one wasn't only the person who struck the blow, but also the 300 people who stood watching while no one stepped forward. And forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness is refusing to become the very person who wounded you. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love, so each day can bring you another story worth hearing. We would truly like to know how this story made you feel, and whether, in your own life, you've ever seen someone treated this way, and what you did in that moment. If you had been in that grand hall that night, would you have stepped forward? Please leave a comment and tell us what you believe from the deepest place in your heart, because every thought you offer is a reminder that every human being deserves respect, no matter what they're wearing or where they stand. May all of you watching this video always enjoy good health, a joyful life, and peace in every passing day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.